Opening the center, d4 immediately stakes a claim and aims to control crucial central squares. Establishing a central pawn presence immediately contests white's initial territorial claim. Challenging the central pawn immediately, aiming for a queenside space advantage and active piece play. Solidifying the center and preparing for a robust pawn chain. This move embraces a more reserved but structurally sound defense. Developing knights towards the center prepares pawn breaks and pressures black's solid setup. Developing a knight to its natural square prepares for central challenges and offers potential counterplay in this Slav structure. Asserting central presence. This knight solidifies control over key squares. Preparing for potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion. This move elegantly addresses the burgeoning tension. Challenging black's knight directly. White's bishop aims to disrupt harmonious development and potentially gain a tempo if black hesitates. Challenging the bishop's placement immediately asks for a commitment and clarifies white's intentions regarding the queenside. Sacrificing the bishop here unwinds black's pawn structure, potentially weakening their kingside and opening lines for future queenside expansion. Observe how the dark squares around the king now lack defenders. Reclaiming the queen establishes a solid pawn structure in the center, though it concedes the bishop pair, which might prove a long-term disadvantage. Demanding careful maneuvering to exploit weaknesses in white's kingside. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure solidifies white's central control and prepares for a potential kingside attack or queenside expansion. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies control over the e5 square. Preparing for potential pawn pushes like e5 and preventing white's knight from easily invading. It also frees the c8 square for the bishop, aiming for a more active role in the center. Preparing to castle kingside. White aims to consolidate their central pawns and activate their king's bishop on the open diagonal, potentially creating attacking chances on the queenside or directly against black's king should it remain exposed. Capturing the pawn immediately concedes central influence, creating a slight imbalance as white's pieces gain more freedom in the core of the board. This decision opens up the c-file for potential pressure later, and black must be mindful of how their queen will be redeployed. Recapturing the pawn solidifies your central pawn structure, but it leaves your king's diagonal a touch more exposed than before. This maneuver now focuses on developing your remaining pieces harmoniously. It's crucial to avoid passive play and prepare for potential central pawn breaks from black. Developing the kingside pawn structure this way grants your monarch more breathing room, albeit at the cost of creating potential weaknesses around your king for later exploitation. Securing the king provides a vital foundation for white's developing plans, shifting focus towards the center and potential pawn breaks while allowing knights to navigate more freely into active squares. Developing the bishop to g7 completes black's kingside castling preparation and positions the bishop on a powerful diagonal, eyeing white's queenside while reinforcing the kingside pawn structure. The queen's sortie to c2 immediately eyes the weak pawn on f7, setting up potential battery play with the bishop on c4 and aiming for a kingside initiative. Solidifying the king's safety in the center. This maneuver tucks the monarch behind a pawn shield, freeing the rooks for potential action on open files or the queenside. A prudent step given the game's emerging symmetry. The knight's audacious leap to e4 immediately challenges the queen and opens up the d-file for potential infiltration. A bold assertion of white's central control by creating immediate tactical complications. Reclaiming the central diagonal, black subtly repositions their queen, preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside or reinforcing the d-file should it open. All while keeping an eye on white's knight, potentially aiming for f6. Shifting the bishop to the queenside aims to free up the e-pawn for potential advance and redeploy the piece to a more active diagonal later, perhaps supporting a queenside expansion or even a central break depending on black's response. Instigating control of the central open file. Black reinforces their presence on the d-file, a strategic maneuver that simultaneously prepares for potential pawn advances later and subtly pressures white's queenside. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to contest the d-file underscores white's intent to seize initiative. Black's queenside expansion begins, aiming to contest the open c-file and potentially create counterplay against white's central pawn structure, all while preparing to reposition the knight, solidifying the pawn structure on the queenside. This move prepares for a potential pawn push later and prevents black from exploiting the a-file for any infiltration, unleashing the rook to the edge of the board on a6. Black signals an audacious intent to seize control of the open a-file, potentially disrupting white's queenside structure and creating dynamic attacking possibilities, reinforcing the rook's presence on the d-file. This maneuver aims to consolidate control and prepare for potential advances along the central corridor, subtly shifting the initiative towards white's central pawns, seeking to unpin the knight and potentially prepare a queenside pawn push. This retreat initiates a repositioning maneuver. By freeing the f6 square, it opens avenues for greater mobility and hints at a future central pawn advance, though it does concede some space and invites further white development towards the kingside. Launching a knight to c5 injects immediate tactical energy, aiming to disrupt black's queenside structure and potentially exploit the weak c6 pawn or the light squares around the king. White is clearly prioritizing active piece play and challenging black's somewhat passive setup. This move signals a shift from positional maneuvering to more direct confrontation, seeking to create imbalances and force black to react definitively. The knight's new outpost could become a powerful attacking platform if black cannot dislodge it efficiently. The rook retreats, seemingly aimlessly, but strategically it seeks to avoid the knight's disruptive influence and potentially redeploy to a more active file later, perhaps the c-file if it opens. The knight boldly ventures to a centralized outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially eye weakness around the kingside. This advance creates immediate tension, forcing black to consider their defensive setup and how to dislodge this imposing piece. Black's bishop now aims to support the queenside pawn push, potentially liberating the c8h3 diagonal and creating some counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Reclaiming the d-file and preparing to exert pressure along it is the clear objective here. The seemingly passive retreat of the rook allows for a regrouping, aiming to consolidate white's influence on the open file. It's a subtle yet crucial maneuver to prepare for potential breakthroughs and to avoid any immediate tactical skirmishes where black's knight on d7 might find a comfortable post by placing the rook on its own d-file. White is not just defending, they are establishing a base for future operations, perhaps supporting a pawn push or creating a battery with the queen. The repositioning also subtly hints at a potential exchange of rooks, which could simplify the position favorably for white if black is not careful. It's a demonstration of patience, building a solid foundation before launching an assault. Developing the bishop to this square, b8, aims to establish a passive defense, seeking to consolidate the position after white's aggressive pawn structure and knight outpost. However, This placement sacrifices crucial development speed and leaves the kingside vulnerable to potential piece penetration, particularly if white can exploit the now unguarded dark squares. The immediate drawback is the significant loss of tempo. The bishop, already developed and then misplaced, is now repositioned again, allowing white to consolidate their central control and prepare for further pawn breaks. The queen's protection of the d7 pawn becomes a point of strategic contention, potentially forcing further defensive maneuvers. Shifting the knight to a4 initiates a strategic regrouping, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses along the c-file. This repositioning also frees up the e-file for potential future action. Answering the knight's challenge on the queenside, the rook repositions itself, a flexible defender now prepared to contest the queenside expansion or potentially support a central push. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white aims to disrupt black's compact setup and open lines for their pieces. This advance immediately contests the d5 square and seeks to gain breathing room for the white queen and king's bishop, which have been somewhat cramped. It's a bold bid for initiative, potentially sacrificing some pawn structure integrity in exchange for active piece play. The knight on e5 looks particularly happy to have this pawn support, projecting further into black's territory. This move sets the stage for potential pawn storms on the kingside or queenside, depending on black's response, and forces black to reconsider their defensive arrangements. A strategic retreat for the queen, shifting it to a more active diagonal and preparing to contest the c-file while also bolstering the queenside pawn structure against potential breakthroughs. Reclaiming central space and preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn structure, the knight sidesteps the bishop's diagonal and surveys potential outposts. Securing the c-file's dominion becomes paramount, establishing a presence that could prove disruptive as the game progresses. A bold push. This e5 immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for white's pieces, potentially creating attacking avenues towards the black king. Observe how this advance restricts the scope of black's knight on f6 and seeks to gain space on the queenside as well. Unveiling the knight to d7, black seeks to reactivate this misplaced piece from the edge of the board, aiming to bring it back into the central fray. It's a positional retreat aimed at improving coordination, potentially preparing a future advance on the queenside or supporting a central pawn push. This maneuver addresses the knight's current inactivity and seeks to rebalance white's increasing spatial advantage with more dynamic piece play. Initiating a positional squeeze by anchoring the rook on the semi-open c-file, white seeks to exploit the potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure while simultaneously bolstering their own queenside defense. A bold attempt to inject life into the queenside, fracturing white's pawn chain and opening a diagonal for the queen. But it comes at the cost of creating a potential weakness on d5 and potentially overextending the bishop. A bold bid to seize the initiative. This queen repositioning immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and probes for weaknesses, potentially aiming to exploit the uncastled king's safety or open lines for an attack. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure with b6 creates a more solid barrier against white's advanced central pawns and prepares to potentially activate the queenside pieces, particularly the rook on a8. This strategic maneuver aims to bolster the king's safety and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, subtly limiting black's developing options while maintaining flexibility. Focusing on the queenside initiative, black repositions the queen to b8, a subtle but important step to coordinate with the a-pawn advance and pressure the b2 square. This redeployment not only prepares for potential queenside pawn breaks like b5 but also subtly hints at a future rerouting of the queen if the queenside battle intensifies. Perhaps towards the c7 pawn or even back to the center via c7. The aim is to create a more active role for the queen, avoiding its current passive placement on e7, and to prepare for white's potential pawn push on the kingside by maintaining queenside pressure. Unlocking the center with a bold pawn thrust, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain and aims to pry open lines for attack. This aggressive gambit injects considerable tension into the position, forcing black to make difficult decisions regarding pawn structure and king safety. The opening of the d-file could prove decisive if black miscalculates the subsequent exchanges, potentially leading to rapid material loss or a compromised king. Seizing the opportunity to simplify and open lines, nxe5 aims to immediately break white's central pawn chain and create potential attacking chances for black's knight on the newly accessible squares. Exploiting the centralized knight's new freedom, this maneuver immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to seize initiative on the open files, potentially leading to a kingside attack if black cannot consolidate their defenses. Seizing the initiative, the queen captures the knight, initiating a dynamic redistribution of material and opening a critical diagonal towards white's king, while simultaneously preparing to contest the d-file and challenge white's central pawn majority. Simplifying the position by trading queens is a logical step here, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and potentially transition into a favorable middle game or endgame where white's slightly more active pieces can be better utilized, especially after the pawn exchange on the queenside. The immediate capture on e5 simplifies the position drastically, offering black a significant advantage in material and an easier path to consolidating their forces. This exchange strategically opens up the b7 pawn, which can now potentially support an advance on the queenside, while also freeing the bishop on e5 to actively participate in the game, perhaps targeting white's kingside or controlling key central squares. Capturing the pawn on b6 opens up the b-file and targets black's light squares, potentially creating weaknesses around the king while also simplifying the position towards a more favorable endgame for white. Reclaiming the b-file's control is paramount as white's knight now occupies the potent c5 square, effectively strangling black's queenside expansion possibilities. The immediate goal is to challenge that centralized knight and liberate the pinned rook. The knight's jump to the queenside disrupts black's tentative pawn structure, aiming to exploit the weak square on b6 and potentially infiltrate further into enemy territory, creating dynamic imbalances. Harnessing the newly opened diagonal, black repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's central control and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside should white's pawn structure falter. Seizing that open file now opens up significant attacking possibilities, forcing black's pieces into a more defensive posture. Reclaiming the central pawn allows black to finally liberate their pieces from their cramped positions, initiating a more dynamic phase of the game where tactical exchanges become more probable. Repositioning the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's weakened queenside pawns and potentially open lines for the rooks. Seizing the open file offers a dynamic counterplay against white's exposed king, creating immediate threats of infiltration. Retrieving the sacrificed pawn and simplifying the material balance, white initiates a decisive endgame advantage by winning back the material. Capturing the knight on b2 initiates a dynamic trade, simplifying the position and ushering in an endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. A crucial moment to seize the initiative and exploit black's momentarily exposed king by creating immediate threats down the open file. Dismantling white's pawn chain unlocks immediate dynamic potential for black, forcing a re-evaluation of the board's central structure and opening lines for the bishop. A daring repositioning, steering the knight toward active play despite its current isolation, aiming to disrupt black's central pawn thrust and potentially threaten its advanced pieces. Reclaiming the bishop allows black to re-establish a defensive pawn chain and prevent white from dominating the c-file with increased pressure, though the material disadvantage remains a significant challenge. Reclaiming the central outpost and preparing to activate the remaining pieces is the immediate goal. After a series of exchanges, a bold pawn grab, sacrificing positional clarity for material gain, which might prove too ambitious given the exposed nature of white's king and the coordinated pieces. Black has marshaled on the queenside, asserting dominion over the central files. This rook penetrates to the 7th rank, disrupting black's coordination and threatening to exploit any weaknesses in the pawn structure. Securing the monarch's flight path away from the exposed central files becomes paramount now that the queens are off the board and the opponent's knight lurks on a dangerous outpost. Unleashing a knight fork now exploits the pinned bishop and threatens the rook directly, forcing a difficult decision for black regarding material and piece activity. Resuming activity on the rook file offers a chance to reignite counterplay, though the immediate danger to the king necessitates extreme caution. Initiating a direct assault on the enemy king's safety is the primary goal, as the knight sacrifices itself to expose the vulnerable royal. Reactivating the bishop to d6 now aims to secure the d4 pawn, which is currently hanging after the king's move and could become a target for white's knight. Recapturing the pawn with the rook aims to immediately simplify the position and exploit the exposed black king, even though it concedes a central pawn. The pawn push aims to activate the bishop on a3 and potentially create a passed pawn, but it walks into a tactical refutation. This repositioning of the rook to the d2 square aims to solidify defense along the 2nd rank and potentially prepare for a rook lift, adding flexibility to white's defensive setup while also keeping an eye on any potential counterplay down the d-file. Unveiling the bishop to b4 suddenly activates this piece, eyeing the white king's defenses and potentially creating new tactical skirmishes. Snatching the pawn now crystallizes the pawn structure and opens a path for the rook to become active again, although it does allow black to simplify into an endgame where they might have some drawing chances. With their active bishop, a desperate lunge aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps create counterplay by forcing the exchange of the bishop, but the initiative has long since evaporated. The knight hops to a central outpost, surveying the board and reinforcing potential advances while simultaneously setting a trap for the bishop on a3. Bringing the bishop back into the fray activates a previously passive piece, aiming to create more dynamic counterplay and potentially defend against the encroaching white knights. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost offers a dynamic threat on the queenside, aiming to exploit the currently undefended pawn on b3. Rescuing the rook from its corner entrapment, black desperately seeks a way to activate its dormant pieces and contest the open files, hoping to create counterplay before white's pieces fully coordinate for the final assault. Regaining the pawn structure on the queenside is paramount, and this relocation of the rook to the open file aims to achieve that by preparing for exchanges and simplifying into a potentially winning endgame where white's extra pawn can be leveraged. Shifting the bishop to c5 aims to redeploy the piece, potentially to defend the pawn on d3 or to create new attacking avenues on the queenside. But it leaves the pawn on d4 vulnerable to further pressure. The king embarks on a perilous journey, seeking refuge from immediate threats on the kingside, but its exposed position could become a significant liability in the evolving endgame dynamics. Unlocking the bishop's latent power. This maneuver injects dynamism into black's pieces, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched structure and create counterplay. Reclaiming the open file offers white a chance to regroup and contest crucial lines. Relocating the rook to the second rank immediately puts it in a position to contest the open file and potentially infiltrate white's defenses, aiming to disrupt white's recently consolidated structure and force concessions. Introducing a pawn creates an additional defensive perimeter for the king, potentially hindering black's advancing pieces. Securing the monarch's escape path amidst the skirmish opens avenues for a potential rally. A quiet consolidation of forces, aiming to activate the rook on the open c-file while maintaining pressure on black's bishop. Securing the bishop's position on the queenside offers a crucial defensive outpost and prepares for potential counterplay on the a-file, preventing white's knight from further incursions. Securing the queenside rook becomes paramount, preventing its maneuver to the active 7th rank and maintaining control over the crucial b-file. The bishop's repositioning to the center of the board immediately exerts pressure along the open files and prepares to potentially infiltrate white's territory, aiming to disrupt their coordination and exploit any potential weaknesses that may arise from their pawn structure. The rook tucks back, a repositioning maneuver that subtly fortifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares to support a potential pawn push with the g-pawn, aiming to create space for the king and perhaps launch a slow assault. Seeking to finally activate his isolated king and potentially create a passed pawn with the d-pawn, the black king ventures further onto the kingside, leaving its previous somewhat safer square. Securing that rook on the open file represents a calculated risk, potentially leading to a pawn push that could unravel black's defenses or, conversely, leaving it vulnerable if black finds a way to exploit its forward placement. Capturing the knight opens a path for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially create counterplay along the c-file. The pawn grab here simplifies things significantly, initiating an endgame where white's material advantage should prove decisive. The rook on g2 aggressively probes for activity, aiming to exploit the open files and create threats against white's weakened king position.